this is not only a global conflict, not just a localized conflict between Israelis and Palestinians, but a globalized one that affects the whole world system. But it also has tremendous implications even locally, because in a sense, the Palestinians are guinea pigs. If we look at the occupation as a laboratory for the testing of all kinds of new weaponry that we saw in Gaza for the first time in any military conflict, weaponry that's so new and so deadly that it's not even covered, for example, in the chemical warfare treaties. Tactics of counterinsurgency, of urban warfare, the deaths of civilians more than any combatants, and legitimized doctrine of military warfare that legitimizes the death of civilians. It's one whole package, from the military to security firms to your local police department here. And I think that what happened in Gaza and what happens in the cities and towns and villages of the West Bank is exported. And it becomes a part of what I call a global pacification industry. And I don't know if you know about the Canada-Israel Public Safety Cooperation Agreement that was signed last year with your illustrious Stockwell Day and our illustrious Avi Dichter, in which Israel is now involved in your prisons, in border control in Canada, in terms of so-called illegal immigration, policing in Canada. Public safety is not military. Public safety is local police. And so I think there's also a global dimension here in terms of how this impacts on local communities all over the world that I'd like to touch on if I have time. This is a map of what we call the two-state solution. And from the point of view of Israel, you can ask the question, what's wrong with this map? It seems like perfect for Israel, because the two-state solution is a solution to the conflict in which it's true you have a Palestinian state next to the state of Israel, but it's not exactly a fair and just division. It isn't a 50-50 division. If we look at this as one country, from the Mediterranean to the Jordan River, Palestine, the land of Israel, the Holy Land, as one integral country, today, half the population of this country is Palestinian. And that's before any refugees return. There are 4 or so million refugees living around in the countries around. And yet, the two-state solution leaves Israel on 78% of the country, of 78% of historical Palestine, and the Palestinian state that would be alongside in the occupied territories, in the West Bank, East Jerusalem, and Gaza, would arise in only 22% of the country. So if we go back to 1988, 20 years ago, the Palestinians, the PLO, when it represented all the Palestinians, accepted the two-state idea. I mean, we hear about Ehud Barak's generous offer. We never hear about Arafat's maybe too generous offer. That was made 20 years ago. This is before the Oslo peace process. So the question is, if Israel really wants peace and security, which is what it's claiming all the time, why didn't it grab this 20 years ago? So if they didn't grab it 20 years ago, it means that there's something else going on here. Something else besides or beyond peace and security that somehow isn't being said. Something else is happening here. What is that something else? I call it partly the issue of exclusivity. And the problem is, even though this underlies the conflict that underlies Israeli policy, if you're not Jewish, you can't say this. That's the problem. If you say this, what's written here, you're going to be called anti-Semitic. Now, I can say it because I'm a self-hating Jew, so I can live with that. That's fine. But for non-Jews to be called anti-Semitic can be pretty intimidating. There's two basic problems. First of all, there's this idea of exclusivity. Without getting into, I don't have time now for a whole discussion of 19th century nationalism, but, we have to go back to some of those kinds of things. Israel presents itself as a Western democracy, right? Which is a code, partly, for, all right, if there's a clash of civilizations, you know what side you're on. And Israel is the only democracy in the Middle East. And one of the ways in which Israel endears itself to the West as an ally, but more than just an ally, as an extension of the West, in a sense, a bastion of the West, even in the Middle East. Chomsky called Israel America's largest aircraft carrier. Is by presenting us in Western terms. We're a Western democracy, white, kind of is bracketed in that. But Israel isn't a Western democracy. It isn't a Western country. It has that facade. And it looks white. It looks European. It even looks like a democracy in certain ways. But it isn't, because it has a radically different ideology, and the nationalism, the definition of Israel is coming from a very different place. Because in the 18th and 19th centuries, when nationalism began to emerge in Europe, you had two major streams. One was what you have in Canada, or Western Europe, or the United States. And that is what we can call a civil nationalism. The idea being that you have states, and the state belongs to its citizens. You have a concept of citizens. So that your national identity is different from your ethnic identity. You can be Muslim, Jewish, Christian, any other religion. You can be black or white or have different ethnic backgrounds. All that's important. But if I ask you, who are you? What's your nationality? You take out your passport. And you say, I'm a Canadian, or I'm an American, or I'm British, or whatever. Because you're a citizen, your national identity is the same as your passport. In Eastern Europe, and in Central Europe, before World War II, there was a completely different kind of nationalism that emerged. And we might call it, just in shorthand, a tribal form of nationalism. Sometimes it's called organic nationalism or integral nationalism. There's all kinds of different words. And that is that your nationalism was defined by blood, by tribe, by turf, homeland, fatherland, motherland, all these primordial terms that we use. And in Europe, in Eastern and Central Europe, in the 19th century, there were two major forms of nationalism. One was, in Eastern Europe, Pan-Slavism. And Pan-Slavism belonged to the Slavs. If you weren't Slavic, you weren't a part of it. So that the Jews, for example, lived for 1,000 years in Russia and were never considered Russians. As a matter of fact, the Jews never even spoke Russian, for the most part. They spoke Yiddish. And they were separated in the Pale of Settlement. They weren't, because Russia is really a tribe. There's a concept, tribes with flags. Israel, Zionism, comes out of that context. In other words, we're taking back the turf that belongs to us. And it belongs to us either because God gave it to us, or because the Bible says it's ours, or whatever, just like Russia belongs to the Russians. And so the idea then is that this land of Israel belongs exclusively to the Jewish people. And this is the fly in the ointment, the idea of exclusivity. Because had the Jews, the problem isn't that the Jews are there. I live there. And there's a subtext, I moved there. So obviously, if I saw Israel as simply a European colonial implant, I wouldn't have gone there. I mean, I don't want to spend my life as a colonist. I mean, there is a genuine tie. That's not the problem. Jews living in the land of Israel, or even Jews reviving their national culture. There was a concept of cultural Zionism. That's not the problem. Had Jews come to this country 100 years ago, 80 years ago, and said, we see this as our homeland. We're a nation like other nations with the right of self-determination. We want to come home and revive our national culture. We want to revive the Hebrew language. And we're also persecuted. We see this also as a refuge. But we acknowledge and recognize that there is another people living in this country who see it equally as their homeland and have equal rights. I think the conflict wouldn't have been inevitable. It wouldn't have been easy, because binational states aren't so easy because nations claim self-determination. They don't share common states well. I mean, you know that in Canada. Nevertheless, I think you could have worked something out. And there were voices like that 100 years ago. They were both Jewish voices and they were Palestinian voices of reconciliation, of accommodation, of cooperation before 1948. What destroyed it all until today is this idea of exclusivity. So this is the essential problem in a sense. And whether you're a religious settler that believes this land was given to us by God, or you're a secular nationalist like Sharon, or Netanyahu who's coming back next week as prime minister, it's the same thing. This is exactly what motivates especially the right wing in the Israeli political system, which is the dominant wing today. We're going to have an extremely right-wing government soon, including a party that's called Israel is Our Home. That's the name of the party of Avigdor Lieberman, who's a Russian immigrant who heads a party whose main plank, whose main program is the transfer of Arabs out of our country. The right wing is saying this belongs to us, and therefore we need it. The left wing is saying it doesn't really belong to us. We can envision a two-state solution, but we can't go there because the Arabs will just use that to attack us, and therefore we have to control the entire country. So you get to the same place, whether you're coming from a right-wing Zionist perspective or a left-wing security military perspective. So where we're going then, if we don't accept the two-state solution and can't accept it, and in fact we've created facts on the ground that I'll show you in 1 second that prevent the emergence of a viable Palestinian state, where we're going is here. Because there's an internal contradiction. This is our land. It belongs to us. We'll never give it to, or parts of it to Arabs. But we have a problem. Okay? There are almost 4 million Palestinians that live in the occupied territories that we can't digest. We're stuck with them. You know, we can't throw them out of the country. We'd like to. We call it transfer. And Lieberman's party is going to be maybe the third largest party in the parliament on the basis of throwing them out of the country. So there's no moral problem with that. There's no logistical problem. It's simply a PR, issue. How would it look? How would the consulate in Vancouver be able, or the Jewish Community Center, be able to sell that? Because we're trying to present ourselves as a Western democracy. So it doesn't quite work. So we can't do that right now. We can't throw them out. Now, you could say, okay, if this is all the land of Israel, and it's one country, fine. So let's go with that. Let's make it one country. Now, if you're a democracy, you've got to give the Arabs the votes, right? Well, we can't do that, because if we do that, it's not a Jewish country. So forget that option. So, and we won't give the Palestinians a third option, which is peace, based on a two-state solution, in which we're on 78% of the land. We can't do, or won't do, because that's giving too much. 22% is too much to give to the Arabs, because this is our country. So the whole, it boils down to, how do we get the Arabs off our hands and leave ourselves in control of the country? That's the essence of what we're trying to do. And the logic is the logic of apartheid. The idea then, the way to do that is exactly what South Africa tried. Except Israel thinks it can get away with the Bantustan in the way that South Africa couldn't. And so the idea is we'll lock the Palestinians into 15% of the country. Not 22, but 15% in a truncated Bantustan, a mini-state. In other words, in 4 cantons, what we call cantons. In the north of the West Bank, in the center, in the south, and Gaza, without Jerusalem. And then they have their state, right? It's a kind of a Palestinian Ciskai. We'll find a Palestinian collaborator that'll be the president, just like South Africa did, that'll sign off on it. And we're home free. You want a two-state solution? All right, here's a two-state solution for you. And we'll get a Palestinian to sign off that it's okay. And the idea then being that we control, Israel controls the border with Arab countries, including the border with Egypt. So the Palestinians have no border with an Arab country. We control, obviously, the land around. We control all the water. We control the movement of Palestinians, both outside of the country and internally. We control the whole Jerusalem area, which cuts the economic heart out of a Palestinian state. We control the economy, and we even control the airspace. And this is the way out. So that, in a sense, how do you explain the attack on Gaza then? In a sense, what you have here is an apartheid state situation that's in place. Everything is in place. You have the facts on the ground that have created this, settlements and walls and everything else. I'll take a minute and show you in a second. You've got the United States and Europe supporting this, and Canada supporting this. You have a political process that's called the Annapolis process that many of us have forgotten about, but it's still going on. The Annapolis process, which is exactly to nail this down. You've got a Palestinian collaborator. You even have an Egyptian collaborator, right? And you've pacified the West Bank. So, and then, working with Abbas, we've armed him. General Dayton, the American general, has trained a Palestinian mini army and militia. Israel and the United States has given him arms, and he's now policing the West Bank for Israel.